The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes as the snow piled up against the door. Winter had always been a season I dreaded, but this year it felt different, more oppressive, colder than usual. Inside our apartment, the heating unit hummed in the background, but it did little to push back the chill that seemed to settle into the corners of the room. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, later than I expected. My roommate, Evan, was usually back by now. He'd been working late at the bar, and I knew he had plans to meet some friends afterward. I hadn't heard the door open, no sound of him stumbling and tired or complaining about the cold, which was odd. The silence felt heavier tonight, almost suffocating. It wasn't unusual for him to stay out late, but for some reason, tonight, it bothered me more than usual. Maybe it was the storm outside, or the way the apartment felt too empty when I was the only one in it. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my chest. Evan and I had been roommates for almost a year now. We had a simple, routine friendship, nothing complicated. He was straight, or at least, he always said he was. We'd often hang out after work, watching movies or drinking beer, but the lines had never blurred. At least, not for me. The quiet continued, gnawing at me, and I found myself glancing toward his room. There was something unnerving about the thought of him not coming home at all tonight, as if the night was stretching out into something I couldn't control. Something unspoken seemed to linger between us recently, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The way he looked at me sometimes, like there was more behind his gaze than the usual friendly camaraderie. I tried not to read too much into it, but it was hard not to notice. Just as I leaned back into the couch, the door creaked open, the familiar sound of the key turning in the lock pulling me from my thoughts. Evan stepped inside, shaking snow from his jacket, his hair tousled, his cheeks flushed from the cold. He looked tired, but there was something different in his eyes tonight, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Hey!" he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I sat up, tucking the blanket around me, forcing a smile. "Long night?" He nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to mine, then quickly looking away. "Yeah, you could say that." He closed the door behind him and tossed his jacket over the chair. His eyes lingered on the couch for a moment before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You still up?" I nodded, feeling the tension between us thickening. "Couldn't sleep. How about you?" He hesitated before answering, stepping toward the small kitchen area. "Couldn't sleep either, actually." The way his voice trailed off sent a strange thrill through me, but I couldn't explain why. He was still my roommate, my friend. Nothing more. But in that moment, something shifted, as if the familiar routine we had shared was about to crack open. I didn't know then, but the winter night had already begun to change everything between us. The apartment felt quieter than usual as Evan moved around, unpacking his things, barely acknowledging my presence. The soft glow of the overhead light flickered faintly, casting long shadows against the walls. I couldn't help but notice how his movements seemed heavier tonight, as though something was weighing on him, something he wasn't ready to share. It felt as if the air between us was thicker now, more charged. I had always been able to read Evan, his quick laugh, his joking demeanor, but tonight it was different. I watched as he set down his bag, then opened the fridge, his back to me. The silence lingered, and my mind wandered to all the subtle things I had noticed over the past few weeks. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long when he looked at me, the way his smile seemed to falter when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Something was changing, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. "Evan?" My voice was softer than I intended, but I couldn't help myself. He turned, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest second before he quickly looked away, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Yeah." I swallowed, not sure how to put the question into words. "You okay? You seem off tonight." His fingers tightened around the edge of the fridge, his gaze dropping to the floor as he shifted uneasily. "It's nothing. Just tired, you know. The night shift always messes with me." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. There was more to it. I could feel it. I shifted on the couch, uncertain of what to say next. I wanted to ask him what was really bothering him, but the words felt stuck in my throat. For the past few months, we'd been close. Too close for just being roommates, but I hadn't let myself think about it too much. I liked the friendship we had, but tonight, there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, something that buzzed beneath the surface of every interaction. Evan dropped onto the chair across from me, running a hand through his hair, clearly avoiding my eyes. The tension was suffocating, and I could feel the pull of his presence in the room, the space between us growing smaller but more charged. The silence stretched on until he let out a heavy sigh, breaking the quiet. "I don't know why I'm acting like this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I need to tell you something." The words hung in the air like a warning. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. What was he about to say? I felt my pulse quicken, my palms suddenly sweaty. I wasn't ready for whatever it was, but I knew I had to hear it. "I've been thinking about things," he continued, his voice so low that I almost didn't catch it. "About us." The word us echoed in my mind, leaving me paralyzed. I opened my mouth, but the words didn't come. What was he implying? The thought alone made me feel like I was on the edge of something I couldn't control. He leaned forward, running his hands over his face. "I know we've talked about this before, about me being straight, but..." He paused, almost like he was searching for the right words. "I think I might be wrong." The room seemed to close in on me. I couldn't process it, not immediately. Evan was confused? Maybe this was just another one of his drunken rants after a tough shift, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. His words hit me like a physical punch, leaving me breathless and unsure of how to respond. "You think you're wrong," I echoed, trying to steady myself. My voice sounded hollow, distant, even to my own ears. He nodded slowly, his gaze flickering to me before darting away. "I've been thinking about you, about us, for a while now." The air between us felt heavy, as if we were both caught in the tension, not knowing which direction to go. My stomach twisted in knots. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? I wanted to speak, to ask him if he was serious, if this was some kind of joke. But the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched out again, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. "I don't know what to do with these feelings," Evan confessed, his voice cracking slightly. "I never thought it would happen, but now, I can't stop thinking about you, about being with you." The world felt like it tilted on its axis, the earth beneath my feet suddenly unsteady. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum of confusion and fear. I felt my hands trembling, but I didn't move. I was too scared to say anything, too scared to make the wrong move. I shifted, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed to come. "Evan, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his tone urgent, like he was afraid I'd pull away before he finished. "I know it's complicated. I never meant for this to happen, but I can't help it. I've never felt like this before." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words felt too heavy, too wrong to say aloud. "We've been friends for so long, roommates for a year. We were supposed to be like brothers, nothing more." But what he was saying now, it shattered that idea. The tension in the room was palpable. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. My chest ached with the weight of the emotions I was struggling to control. I wanted to tell him that I felt the same way, that I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about him, but the fear held me back. The fear that this could ruin everything. Evan's gaze was on me again, his eyes searching mine for something, an answer, a signal that I understood. But I couldn't give him that. I couldn't give him anything when I didn't know what I wanted myself. He stood up, moving toward the window, his back to me. The rain had picked up again, the sound of it against the window almost deafening in the stillness of the room. I watched the silhouette against the glass, his shoulders slumped, his figure etched in shadow. "I never meant to put this on you," he said quietly, "but I can't ignore it anymore. I don't know what this means for us, but I need to be honest with you." The air was still, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words failed me. I didn't know if I was ready for this, ready for the shift that had taken place between us. Was I supposed to accept it? Push it away? I couldn't make sense of it, not yet. All I knew was that my feelings had changed too, whether I was ready to admit it or not. "You don't have to say anything," Evan said, turning his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed you to know." And with that, the room fell silent again, filled only with the sound of the rain and the hum of the heating unit. But the tension remained, thick and undeniable. Neither of us knew what would happen next. I was still trying to figure that out myself. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling as if it, too, felt the weight of the words hanging between us. The sound of rain pounding against the window mirrored the chaos in my mind, a relentless, deafening rhythm that wouldn't let me think clearly. I had never felt so lost, so uncertain. Evan was standing at the window, his shoulders tense, his back to me, but I could still feel the weight of his presence in the room. I could feel the heat from the radiator nearby, but it did nothing to warm the cold that had spread through the space. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Evan's confession was still hanging in the air, thick and heavy. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected any of it. He was my friend, my roommate, the guy I shared everything with. But now, in this moment, I could feel everything shifting. Something was changing, and I didn't know how to stop it. His voice broke the silence again, low and hesitant, as though testing the waters. "I've never been in this situation before. I don't know what's real anymore." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding in my chest, my palms clammy. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt trapped, like I couldn't form the right ones. He was still standing there, facing the window, his figure illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlight outside, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, all I could do was watch him. His hands gripped the edge of the windowsill tightly, his knuckles white with the pressure. The storm raged on outside, but inside, everything was still. Still and waiting. Waiting for something to break, for something to happen. I swallowed hard, finally forcing myself to speak. "Evan, I don't," my voice faltered, cracking under the weight of my own uncertainty. He turned then, his eyes searching mine with a look I couldn't read. His gaze was intense, raw, like he was looking for something. Maybe understanding, maybe forgiveness, maybe something else entirely. He took a few slow steps toward me, his movements deliberate but uncertain, as though he was afraid of what he might do next. The space between us was filled with a quiet tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his calm exterior. "But I can't stop thinking about you, about us." The words hung in the air, and I felt the earth shift beneath me, my heart racing in my chest. The air was thick with unspoken desire, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on me, suffocating me. His words had an undeniable gravity, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to accept them. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My thoughts were scattered, racing in every direction. What did this mean? What was happening? How was I supposed to process everything he had just said? My mind was in a whirlwind, but all I could focus on was the sound of his breathing, shallow and uneven, matching the frantic beat of my heart. Evan closed the distance between us, and I could feel the warmth of his body near mine, his presence overwhelming. He was so close now. I could hear the rustle of his clothes, the soft exhale of breath as he looked at me, his eyes searching for something, an answer, a reaction. I wasn't sure, but I couldn't look away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain outside. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I need to know if you feel the same way." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as I stood there, frozen. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion, desire, and guilt. What did I feel? Was this just a fleeting moment for him? Or was this something real? Something that could change everything? My breath caught in my throat as his hand reached out, brushing lightly against my arm. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. It was like everything I'd been avoiding, everything I'd been trying to deny, came rushing to the surface. I looked up at him, my eyes meeting his, and for the first time I saw it. The vulnerability in his gaze, the uncertainty in the way his lips parted, as if he wasn't sure if he should make the next move, if he should cross that line. The storm outside seemed to crescendo, the wind howling louder now, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that moment, I knew that everything was about to change. The tension between us was unbearable, the pull between us undeniable. My voice cracked again and I shook my head, the words trapped in my throat. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what. I didn't know what this meant for us, for our friendship, for everything we had built. Evan's hand was still on my arm, his fingers brushing over my skin, sending sparks of heat through me. His eyes were fixed on mine, searching, waiting. His lips parted slightly, and I could feel the weight of the moment building, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. And then it happened. He leaned in, slowly, deliberately, his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and urgent. His eyes were closed now, his lips so close I could taste the anticipation in the air. The space between us was charged with something I couldn't name, something dangerous, something real. Before I could pull away, his lips pressed softly against mine. It was tentative at first, gentle, as if he was afraid I might pull back. But I didn't. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, slow and hesitant. But it was enough to shatter the walls we had built around us. The world outside continued to rage, the storm a distant echo to the storm we had just unleashed between us. The kiss was everything I had been avoiding, everything I had been trying to deny. It was everything I wanted and everything I feared. When we finally pulled apart, the silence was deafening. Neither of us spoke, neither of us moved. We stood there, inches apart, our breath mingling in the still air, the weight of everything we had just done hanging over us like a fragile thread, waiting to snap. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. But I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. The kiss had barely ended, but its impact lingered between us like a heavy fog. The air felt thicker now, filled with something raw and uncertain, something neither of us could escape. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt stuck in my throat. What could I say? How could I explain this? How could I make sense of it when I still didn't understand it myself? Evan stood there, just inches away, his eyes avoiding mine, his breathing uneven. The vulnerability in his gaze was so palpable that it made my chest tighten. His lips were slightly parted, as though he was waiting for me to speak, to say something that would make everything okay again. But I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to fix this. I turned away, walking toward the window, needing the space between us, needing to breathe. The rain had slowed, but the storm inside me hadn't let up. I could feel the tension in my own body, the conflict inside me gnawing at my insides. Evan's confession, the kiss, it had all happened so quickly, so unexpectedly. One moment, everything was fine, and the next, everything had changed. Behind me, I heard Evan shift, his footsteps hesitant and slow, like he was unsure whether to approach or to give me the space I so desperately needed. His voice was soft when he spoke, like he was trying to keep his words from shattering the fragile silence. I didn't mean to make this weird, you know. I didn't know what to do either. I didn't turn around, but I could hear the sincerity in his voice. It made something in me ache. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was okay, that nothing had changed, but the words didn't come. We had always been friends, roommates, nothing more. And yet the kiss, that kiss, had changed everything. I could still feel it on my lips, like an electric current that wouldn't dissipate. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that came after it, everything it made me feel, everything it made me question. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady as I finally spoke. We can't just pretend this didn't happen, Evan. I can't just go back to how things were. There was a long silence behind me. I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back, like he was waiting for me to turn around, to give him some kind of reassurance. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready to look at him yet. I wasn't ready to face the feelings that were swirling inside me. "I know," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's complicated. I don't know what's next either." The words hung in the air between us, thick and unresolved. The room felt suffocating, the tension almost unbearable. Every step I took, every breath I drew, felt like it was pushing me closer to something I wasn't ready to confront. I wasn't sure if I wanted to confront it. I had always thought I had my feelings under control. I had never questioned our friendship, never allowed myself to think about Evan in any other way. But now, everything had changed. He had kissed me. I had kissed him back. And I couldn't erase it from my mind. I finally turned around, facing him. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if he were trying to avoid the tension that was almost tangible between us. He looked lost, unsure of what to do next. "I don't want to ruin our friendship," Evan said quietly, looking up at me finally. His expression was one of guilt, as if he was somehow responsible for the mess we found ourselves in. "I don't want to lose you." The words hit me harder than I expected. I knew he was sincere. I knew he cared about me. But hearing him say it aloud made it all feel so much more real. The guilt inside me grew heavier. I didn't want to lose him either, but I didn't know how to keep things the same after what had just happened. "You didn't ruin anything," I said, my voice barely audible. "But I don't know how to go back. I don't know what to do with this." Evan nodded, his face a mixture of frustration and confusion. "I don't know either. I don't know what I'm doing. I just couldn't ignore it anymore. I thought maybe you felt the same." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability, the fear. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't the only one struggling. Evan was just as lost as I was, just as afraid of what this could mean. I took a tentative step toward him, unsure of what I was doing, unsure of what I even wanted. The space between us seemed so vast and yet so close, as if one wrong move could shatter everything. "I don't know how to feel, Evan," I admitted, my voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what this means. For us. For me." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything in the room had faded away. It was just the two of us, standing there, caught in the tension of what we had shared and what we hadn't yet said. "I don't want to lose you either," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But I can't keep pretending I don't want this." I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The space between us felt like a chasm, but I couldn't walk away. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. But I knew one thing. Everything had changed, and there was no going back. Evan reached out slowly, hesitantly, as if waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do, unsure of what I even wanted. And then, before I could make sense of it, his hand brushed against mine. The touch was soft, tentative, but it sent a shiver through me, igniting something deep inside. But before anything else could happen, there was a sound, a sharp knock on the door. We both froze. The moment, the tension, shattered like glass, and just like that, we were thrust back into the world we had been trying to escape. The knock was an interruption, A sudden reminder that the real world was still out there, still waiting for us. Evan's hand fell away from mine. The warmth was gone, leaving only cold space between us. Neither of us moved to answer the door. Neither of us spoke. The knock came again, louder this time. And in that moment, everything was uncertain. The knock on the door echoed in the silence like a drumbeat, and neither of us moved to answer it. My heart was still racing, still pounding from everything that had just happened, from the tension, the kiss, the feeling that had settled between us. Something raw, something real. But now, everything felt out of control. The knock shattered the fragile moment we had shared, pulling us back into reality, back into the world we had been trying to avoid. I couldn't look at Evan. I couldn't look at anyone right now. My hands were shaking, my thoughts scattered. What had we just done? What had I just done? The uncertainty gnawed at me. But what hurt more was a sudden coldness, the distance that had crept between us. We had been so close, but now it felt as though the space between us had grown, as if the kiss had set in motion something neither of us could undo. Evan stood frozen, staring at the door, his body tense. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes flickering with a mixture of confusion and fear. His hand hung by his side, almost as if he was waiting for me to make the next move, to decide what happened next. But I didn't know what to do. I couldn't decide. The knock came again, louder this time, impatient. It felt like the world outside was demanding our attention, demanding we face whatever this was, whatever it had turned into. The storm had died down, but inside, the air was thick with unresolved emotions. I wanted to speak, wanted to say something to break the tension, but no words came. The only sound now was the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. Finally, Evan moved. He stepped toward the door, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was trying to gather himself. I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart in my throat, my breath caught. His hand hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment he hesitated. He looked back at me, and the unspoken question hung in the air between us. Do we keep going? Do we pretend this didn't happen? He opened the door slowly, and the chill from the hallway flooded the room, washing over me like a cold wave. Standing in the doorway was a figure I didn't recognize. A man, older than us, with sharp features and a stern look on his face. His eyes flicked between Evan and me, a knowing expression crossing his face. The tension in the room shot through the roof, and for a second, it felt like everything had stopped. I couldn't read his expression. I couldn't tell if he was angry, confused, or just watching us. And then, before either of us could say anything, the man spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You too," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "We need to talk. Now." I looked at Evan, my mind reeling. Who was this man? What did he want from us? What did he know? The door hung open, the cold air biting at my skin, but it wasn't the cold outside that sent a chill down my spine. It was the uncertainty, the weight of what was happening. Evan's eyes locked onto mine, his expression unreadable, and I could see the fear flicker in his gaze. This wasn't over. This wasn't the end. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger, something neither of us was prepared for. And as the man stepped further into the apartment, his presence like a shadow in the doorway, I knew one thing for sure. Everything was about to change. But what would happen next? Where would we go from here? Would we be able to find a way out of this? Or was there no escape? The door shut behind him, and the world outside disappeared. But what was coming next, neither of us could say. And neither of us could escape the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker, something neither of us could predict.